The river flowed with a quiet but powerful current, reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, but for three men standing on the riverbank, everything was about to change. Jack, a seasoned fisherman, had been teaching his younger brother Tom how to cast a line properly while their friend Brian watched, sipping his soda. The air was crisp, the water cool, and the atmosphere calm until a strange sound shattered the peace. A loud splash followed by a desperate, guttural roar echoed across the river. The men turned instantly, their eyes scanning the water. At first they thought it was just a large fish making a commotion, but then they saw it, something massive struggling against the current. It wasn't just a floating log or a lost animal. It was a bear, a fully grown bear, trapped in the freezing waters, gasping for air as it fought against the relentless force of nature. Panic surged through the three friends as they realized the gravity of the situation. A bear could easily be dangerous, even in distress, but leaving it to drown wasn't an option. Jack was the first to react. His instincts kicked in, and without a second thought, he dropped his fishing rod and rushed toward the edge of the river. "We have to do something," he shouted, his voice laced with urgency. Tom hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you crazy? It's a bear. What if it attacks us?" he argued, but his voice lacked conviction. The sight of the struggling animal was hard to ignore. Brian, the most cautious of the group, looked around desperately for another option. "Maybe we should call for help," he suggested, pulling out his phone. But there was no signal this deep in the woods. The men were on their own. The bear's roars grew weaker, its body slipping further under the surface. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. Without wasting another second, Jack grabbed a long, sturdy branch from the ground and extended it toward the bear. "Come on, grab it!" he yelled, knowing full well the bear wouldn't understand him. The animal thrashed, its massive paws swiping at the air, but it was too weak to hold on. The current was too strong, and every second counted. Tom, still hesitant but unable to watch the bear suffer, ran to the truck and pulled out a thick rope. "Tie it around a tree and throw the other end in," he instructed Brian, who quickly obeyed. They anchored the rope securely while Jack waded into the icy water, holding onto the branch for balance. His muscles tensed as the freezing cold gripped his legs, but he pushed forward, determined. The bear's eyes locked onto Jack's for a brief moment, wild, desperate, and pleading. It was as if the animal understood it was being helped. Summoning what little strength it had left, the bear reached out with its claws, barely managing to hook onto the branch. Jack tightened his grip, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to pull. The weight was incredible, and for a moment, he thought he would be dragged under too. "Help me!" he gritted through clenched teeth. Tom and Brian didn't hesitate. They grabbed onto Jack and the rope, pulling with every ounce of strength they had. The bear let out a guttural groan as its body slowly began to rise above the waterline. The tension was unbearable. The men's feet slipped in the wet mud, their arms burned from the strain, but they didn't let go. Inch by inch, the bear moved closer to the riverbank, the sound of rushing water mixed with heavy breathing and grunts of effort. Just when it seemed like they might not be able to hold on any longer, the bear's massive body finally broke free from the current. It collapsed onto the muddy shore, coughing up water and gasping for breath. The men stumbled back, panting, their bodies aching from exertion. But before they could even celebrate their victory, the bear turned its head toward them. Its dark eyes were unreadable. Was it grateful? Was it angry? Was it about to attack? None of them could tell. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they stood frozen, waiting for the bear's next move. The bear lay on the muddy shore, its massive chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. The water had drained from its thick fur, leaving it soaked and shivering in the cool evening air. Jack, Tom, and Brian stood motionless, watching the creature with a mix of awe and fear. Their muscles ached from the rescue, but the tension in the air was even heavier. The bear was alive, but what happened next was uncertain. Jack's mind raced through every possible scenario. If the bear felt cornered, it could attack. If it was too weak, it might not survive the night. Either way, they were in uncharted territory. "We should back away," Brian whispered, gripping Tom's arm. Slowly. But Jack, still breathing hard, shook his head. "We just saved it. Maybe it knows we're not a threat." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. The bear lifted its head, its dark eyes locking onto them once more. The silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the distant sound of the river's current. Tom swallowed hard, stepping back despite Jack's words. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. "What if it thinks we're the reason it almost drowned?" he muttered, glancing toward the truck. If they made a sudden move, the bear could lunge before they even got the chance to react. Brian nudged Jack urgently. "We need to go. Now!" But Jack stood his ground, watching the bear closely. There was something in its gaze, something that didn't feel like aggression. The bear took a slow, shaky breath and tried to push itself up, but its limbs trembled violently. It was exhausted. Jack hesitated for only a second before he reached down and grabbed his jacket, carefully tossing it a few feet in front of the bear. "Here," he said softly. "It's cold. Maybe it'll help." Tom and Brian stared at him like he had lost his mind. "You're giving your jacket to a bear?" Tom hissed. "What if it doesn't care? What if it charges at you?" Jack didn't answer. He just watched. The bear blinked at the jacket, its wet fur glistening under the fading sunlight. It didn't move for several seconds, and then, to their shock, it let out a low huff and placed its paw over the fabric, pulling it slightly closer. Jack exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it was something. "See?" he murmured. "It understands." Brian rubbed his face, his nerves still on edge. "Yeah, great. Now can we leave before we make it mad?" But Jack wasn't ready to go just yet. He took a cautious step forward, lowering himself slightly to appear less threatening. The bear watched him but didn't move. "We can't just leave it like this," Jack whispered. "It's weak. If another predator comes by—" Tom sighed heavily, running a hand through his damp hair. "Jack, it's a wild animal. We did what we could. We're not bear doctors." His voice wavered, torn between fear and concern. Jack knew he had a point, but still. The bear suddenly let out a deep, rumbling groan and shifted slightly, wincing as it moved. Jack frowned. "It's hurt," he realized, "probably from getting tossed around in the river." He turned to his friends. "If we leave it here, it might not make it." Brian threw up his hands. "And what do you suggest we do? Bring it home. Give it soup." His frustration was clear, but underneath it, he cared too. Jack knew they couldn't do anything extreme, but maybe there was a way to help. "We have food in the truck," he said quickly. "Some leftover fish. We could leave it nearby just to give it a chance." Tom groaned but didn't argue. Jack stayed behind, keeping his eyes on the bear. He still wasn't sure if it saw them as friends or just strange creatures who had interfered in its near-death experience. But as he watched it shift again, struggling to find a comfortable position, he felt an undeniable connection. It wasn't just an animal. It was a living being that had nearly lost its life, just like any of them could have in the same situation. A few minutes later, Tom and Brian returned with a small container of leftover fish from their cooler. "This is insane," Brian grumbled, handing it to Jack. "But whatever, just be careful." Jack knelt down and carefully placed the food a few feet away from the bear, then stepped back slowly. The bear's nose twitched, and after a moment, it weakly dragged itself forward, sniffing the air. The men held their breath as it hesitated, then took a cautious bite. For the first time since pulling it from the river, the bear made a sound that wasn't distressed. It was low and deep, a soft rumble that almost sounded appreciative. The men exchanged glances, their fear slowly giving way to something else. Maybe, just maybe, they had done more than save a wild animal. Maybe they had earned its trust. As the bear chewed the fish, its powerful jaws working slowly, the tension in the air started to fade. Jack, Tom, and Brian remained still, watching closely as the animal swallowed each bite with visible exhaustion. It wasn't eating with the aggression they had expected. It wasn't snarling or growling. Instead, it seemed calm, almost careful, as if it knew this was a rare moment of trust between man and beast. The river behind them continued its steady flow, its deadly current now a distant memory. Jack exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. They had just saved a drowning bear, and now they were standing just feet away as it accepted their help. It was something none of them had ever imagined. Tom nudged Brian. Okay, so it's eating. That's good, right? His voice was still cautious, but there was a hint of relief. Brian, who had been the most skeptical about staying, nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess it is. The men exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. Jack glanced at the sky. The sun was dipping lower, and soon darkness would settle over the woods. They couldn't stay here all night. We should get moving, he said quietly. The bear is still weak, but it's not in immediate danger anymore. Tom and Brian hesitated, their eyes flicking between Jack and the bear. Are we just going to leave it here? Tom asked. I mean, what if it doesn't make it through the night? Jack sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. He understood the concern, but they weren't wildlife experts. They had done what they could. It's a wild animal, he reminded them. It survived this long on its own. We gave it a fighting chance. That's more than most people would have done. Brian nodded in agreement, but Tom still looked uncertain. Just as they were about to turn back toward the truck, the bear suddenly lifted its head and looked at them again. This time, something was different. There was no panic in its dark eyes, no desperate struggle. It wasn't just looking at them, it was acknowledging them. It let out a low, deep sound. Not quite a growl, but something else. A strange mix of exhaustion and gratitude. The sound sent chills down Jack's spine, but not from fear. Did it just thank us? Brian muttered, shifting uneasily. Tom shook his head in disbelief. Bears don't say thank you, he scoffed. But even he didn't sound convinced by his own words. Jack's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Maybe it wasn't a literal thank you, but in the way animals communicated, it sure felt like one. Jack crouched down slightly, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. You'll be okay, he murmured to the bear. He didn't expect the animal to understand, but saying the words felt right. The bear watched him for a moment longer before shifting its massive body, curling slightly into a more comfortable position. It was tired. It needed rest. That much was clear. Tom sighed, finally accepting that there was nothing more they could do. All right, he said reluctantly. Let's go before we get too attached. Brian clapped a hand on his shoulder. Too late for that, buddy. They chuckled softly, the tension between them easing as they stepped away from the bear and back toward their truck. As they walked, the events of the evening replayed in their minds. They had come here for a simple fishing trip, expecting nothing more than a quiet day by the river. Instead, they had been thrown into a life-or-death rescue that none of them would ever forget. Brian shook his head as they climbed into the truck. If I tell people we pulled a bear out of a river, they're not going to believe me. Jack smirked, starting the engine. Then maybe we don't tell them, he said simply. Tom chuckled. Yeah, let's just keep this between us and the bear. They all laughed, but deep down, they knew this was something special. Not everyone gets to say they saved a drowning bear. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, leaving the river behind, Jack couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The bear was still there, resting, its massive body rising and falling with steady breaths. It had survived, and somehow in a strange, unexpected way, it had changed something in them too. They had stepped into nature's world for a brief moment, not as conquerors, not as intruders, but as helpers. And maybe, just maybe, the bear would remember them just as they would always remember it. The ride back to town was quiet, the only sounds coming from the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional rustling of trees as the wind picked up. Jack, Tom, and Brian were lost in their own thoughts, still processing what had just happened. Every time Jack blinked, he saw the bear's dark eyes staring back at him, not with fear, but with something close to understanding. It was an experience that would stay with them forever. Do you think it'll be okay? Tom finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. He wasn't looking at anyone, just staring out the window as the trees blurred past. Brian let out a breath, rubbing his hands together. I don't know, man, but I hope so. Jack tightened his grip on the wheel, his mind replaying the moment they pulled the bear from the river, the struggle, the exhaustion, the way it had curled up after eating. It'll be fine, he said firmly, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for them or for himself. They drove through the winding roads, the headlights cutting through the growing darkness. Town was still miles away, but the comfort of civilization felt closer than ever. The air inside the truck was warm, a stark contrast to the icy river they had been standing in not long ago. Tom shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against his knee. You know, if someone had told me this morning that I'd be fishing, pulling a bear out of a river, and then feeding it dinner, I would have called them crazy. Brian chuckled, shaking his head. Same here. I thought today was just going to be about catching some fish, not playing wildlife rescue. Jack smirked, glancing at them. Well, at least we know we're capable of saving a bear if we ever need to again. Tom groaned. Let's not make this a habit. The road stretched ahead, winding through the dense forest that surrounded their small town. It wasn't until they reached the first streetlights that they fully registered how exhausted they were. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the heavy weight of everything they had done. Brian cracked his neck. I need food and sleep. A lot of sleep. Tom nodded. Same. And a hot shower. I still feel like I'm freezing. Jack didn't say anything. He just kept driving, his mind still half stuck in the woods with the bear. It wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about that unspoken connection. The way the bear had looked at them, the way it had accepted their help without fear in the end. As they pulled into town, the familiar sight of houses and streetlights brought a strange sense of normalcy. It was almost surreal to think about where they had been just an hour ago. They parked outside Brian's place first. He stretched his arms and let out a long sigh before opening the door. All right, see you guys tomorrow, he said, stepping out. If you see a bear following us home, don't be surprised. Tom laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, good night, man. Brian waved as he disappeared inside. Jack and Tom drove a little farther before stopping in front of Tom's house. He hesitated before getting out, then looked at Jack. You okay? Jack blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, just thinking. Tom studied him for a moment before nodding. Well, whatever happens, we did the right thing. Just remember that. Jack nodded, watching as Tom shut the door and walked inside. As Jack drove home alone, the streets grew quieter. The weight of the day pressed down on him. But it wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that what they had done wasn't just a one-time event. It felt like a turning point, like something had shifted inside him. He pulled into his driveway, shut off the engine, and sat in silence for a moment. Then, as if on instinct, he looked up at the dark sky and let out a slow breath. Hope you're okay out there, he murmured, thinking of the bear. Then, with one last glance toward the trees in the distance, he stepped inside, knowing that no matter what, this was a day he would never forget. Jack woke up the next morning with a strange feeling that something had changed. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind. The river, the bear, the way it had looked at them before they left. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his face, trying to shake the lingering sense of unease. Was the bear still there? Had it survived the night? He knew he had no real way of knowing, but the questions gnawed at him. He got up, dressed quickly, and grabbed his phone. A message from Tom was already waiting. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Jack smirked, typing back. If you're thinking about checking on the bear, then yeah. A second later, Tom replied, Brian's in too. Meet you in 20. Jack grabbed his keys and headed out the door, feeling a rush of anticipation. The drive back to the river felt different than the night before. The fear and urgency were gone, replaced by curiosity and a quiet sense of responsibility. Jack, Tom, and Brian had all agreed that it was best to leave the bear alone, to let nature take its course. But that didn't mean they weren't worried. The moment they reached the familiar dirt road leading to the riverbank, a strange tension settled between them. What if it's gone? Brian asked as they parked the truck. Or worse, what if it didn't make it? Tom exhaled. Only one way to find out. They stepped out cautiously, the crisp morning air filling their lungs. The river looked calmer now, its deadly current masked by the gentle ripples on the surface. But their focus was on the shoreline. Jack's heart pounded as they approached the spot where they had left the bear. At first it seemed empty. No sign of movement, no deep paw prints in the mud. Jack's stomach tightened. Maybe it wandered off, he said, trying to sound hopeful. Tom nodded, but Brian frowned. Or maybe something else found it first. The thought made them all uneasy. The forest was full of predators, wolves, mountain lions, even other bears. A weak, injured animal wouldn't stand much of a chance. Jack took a deep breath and stepped forward, scanning the area. And then, just as he was about to give up, he saw it. There, nestled between a cluster of trees just beyond the riverbank, was a massive shape. The bear. It was lying down, its thick fur still damp but no longer dripping. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "It's here," he whispered. Tom and Brian rushed to his side, eyes widening as they spotted the animal. The bear was awake but still weak. Its dark eyes flicked toward them, and for a moment nobody moved. Jack swallowed hard. "We should go," he said quietly. "We don't want to disturb it." But just as they were about to step back, something unexpected happened. The bear shifted slightly, let out a deep, slow exhale, and, against all logic, lowered its head in what almost looked like relief. Tom blinked. Did it just relax? Brian stared at the bear, then at Jack. "Okay, this is getting weird." Jack couldn't deny it. Wild animals didn't just trust humans, especially after such a traumatic experience. But this bear wasn't growling, wasn't standing to defend itself. It was just watching them, calm and accepting. Jack's fingers curled at his sides. He wasn't sure what this meant, but one thing was clear. The bear remembered them, and it wasn't afraid. For several minutes, they just stood there, absorbing the surreal moment. Finally, Tom cleared his throat. "Okay, so now what?" Jack exhaled. "Nothing. We leave it be. It's alive, and that's all that matters." Brian nodded. "Yeah, we did what we could." They turned to leave, but before they could take more than a few steps, the bear made a sound, a low, deep rumble that vibrated through the air. It wasn't a growl. It was something softer, something familiar. Jack froze. Then slowly, he turned back to look at the bear one last time. It was watching them still, its breathing steady, its massive paws curled beneath its body. And in that moment, Jack knew. The bear understood. Maybe not in the way humans did, but in its own way, it recognized what had happened. It remembered the hands that had pulled it from the river, the food that had been left for it, the warmth of kindness in a world that often offered none. Jack swallowed against the lump in his throat. "Take care, big guy," he murmured. The bear blinked, and then finally they walked away, leaving it to heal, to rest, and to live. The walk back to the truck felt different this time. There was no fear, no tension, just a quiet understanding between the three men. They had come back to see if the bear had survived, and not only was it alive, but it had remembered them. That realization sat heavily in Jack's chest, filling him with something he couldn't quite describe. It wasn't just relief, and it wasn't just pride. It was something deeper, something that made the world feel a little bit more connected than it had before. Tom let out a low whistle as they reached the truck. "Well, that was unexpected." Brian nodded, still shaking his head in disbelief. "Yeah, I thought we'd just find some tracks and call it a day. But that?" He glanced back toward the trees, where the bear was still resting. "That was something else." Jack opened the driver's side door but didn't get in right away. He looked out toward the forest, his mind still replaying the moment the bear had looked at them. Not with fear, not with aggression, but with recognition. He had never been one to believe in things like fate or unspoken connections. But this felt different. "We did something good," he finally said, his voice steady. Tom and Brian exchanged glances before nodding. "Yeah," Tom admitted, "we really did." Brian smirked. "Not every day you get to say you saved a bear's life." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Number. And not every day a bear seems to thank you for it." That part still felt unreal. A wild animal showing something that felt like gratitude. If he hadn't seen it himself, he wouldn't have believed it. They climbed into the truck, but none of them started scrolling through their phones or blasting music like they usually did. Instead, they sat there for a moment, soaking in the quiet weight of what had happened. Tom leaned back against the seat, exhaling. "You think it'll remember us if we ever come back?" Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not in the way we remember things, but I think it knows we weren't trying to hurt it. Brian nodded slowly. Yeah, and honestly, that's enough. They all fell silent again, the sounds of nature filling the space around them. As they pulled onto the main road, Jack felt lighter somehow. He had come to the river expecting a simple day of fishing, but he was leaving with something far more valuable. A reminder that kindness, even in the most unexpected moments, had power. That the world wasn't just about survival and struggle, but also about connection, even between species that were never meant to understand each other. The bear might never see them again. It might return to its normal life in the wild, forgetting the strange night it had been saved by humans. But for Jack, Tom, and Brian, that moment would always be with them. The truck rumbled down the road, leaving the forest behind. The bear was still out there, healing, breathing, living. And in some unspoken way, they knew if fate ever brought them back to that river, they might not be alone. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the most unexpected connections, even between man and nature. This story reminds us that compassion doesn't have to be grand or world-changing. It just has to be real. Even when faced with fear and uncertainty, choosing to help can make all the difference. You never know whose life you might touch, or who might remember your kindness in return.